quickly, Wednesday morning Watermark Bible study ladies. My name is Nike Spalding, and I'm the Women's Equipping Coordinator here at Watermark. And so it's my pleasure for those of you who are new to the study to say welcome. And we're glad that you're hopping in with us for the rest of Genesis 25 through 50. And for those of you who've been with us, welcome back. I hope you've had a terrific holiday and that you're ready to jump back in. What we're doing in this video is really a review of Genesis 1 through 24. And so for those of you jumping in, you're going to go, great, I missed the first half, so I'd love to hear all about it. We're not going to pretend that we can actually cover everything in Genesis 1 through 24 in 20 minutes. But hopefully it will give you a foundation to go, okay, I understand what we're leaping off from into this new year. And then for those of you who've been with us, we're certain this will be fruitful as well because it's been several weeks since we met with you. And I know that I could use a refresher. I know it blessed me to go back through those chapters and prepare this message. And so that's what this is. This is a review of Genesis 1 through 24. And hopefully it's going to set the foundation for us to launch into 25 and 26 this Wednesday and then on through the rest of Genesis 25 through 50 for the rest of the semester. And so, I'm excited to teach this. And so one of the things about Genesis that is important to know is who it was written to. Before we can talk about all the different elements of it, it's important to understand why it was written. We believe that Moses wrote this book about 3,500 years ago, and he wrote it to the Israelites. And the Israelites were the Jewish people at this time when Moses writes this book that are just now coming out of captivity. They've been in Egypt for over 400 years. They've been oppressed. They've been heavy laden. At the time when Moses is coming in, if you ever read Exodus, you know their story. Exodus really brings us into the timing of when Genesis is being written to those people who have been under a hard ruler in Pharaoh. And when Moses came in, things were worse for them. And so they're being marched out of Egypt. Literally, they're walking out of Egypt after 400 years of oppression, after 400 years of not hearing God's voice. And they are asking the questions, who is this God that Moses is telling us about? Who is this God that we've heard about? That's the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who we've heard the stories of right now, but we don't know this God. Who is this God? And so Genesis is a little bit of God's resume. He's coming to these people and he's saying, hey, look, you are my people. I am your God. I want you to trust me and follow me out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. And if you know your biblical history, you know that as they come out of Egypt, the land that they need to conquer is full of big, huge, scary people groups who have been established in the land. The Philistines, the Amorites, the Perizzites, all of these ites that you hear about in your Bible. And these are renowned people who know how to fight. They're well trained in that. And we're talking about a famished, impoverished, burdened group of Israelites who are coming out of captivity. And God's going to tell them, go into this land that I promised your forefathers and take it over. And so Genesis, although we've talked about it being 4 events and 4 people, those 4 events and those 4 people are really to expose who this God is. Is this a God worth following? Is this a God who, when he takes you out of Egypt, and you have to trust him to walk out while the Egyptians are chasing you on chariots and horses? And then he gets you to the Red River and he splits it and you walk through the Red Sea with Moses and you get to the other side and he says, hey, I want you to go conquer this land. Can you trust that God? Is he faithful? Is he loving? Is he kind? Why did he leave us in captivity in the first place? Should I go with him? And what's so great about Genesis is God's going to answer those questions for them, and he's going to answer those same questions that we have today. Because if you're anything like me, I ask God, hey, are you worth trusting? Is it worth trusting you when I'm going through this hardship? Is it worth trusting you when these trials come along? Is it worth trusting you when I just don't know what I should do? And Genesis is God's resume, and what we've learned from this book and what we will continue to beat the drum and the voice of is that God is faithful despite our failure. That God is faithful to humanity despite what humanity does. And so when you read Genesis, think about it in terms of if I'm coming out of Egypt, what do I need to know about God in order to have the faith to go conquer the land of Canaan? And so I mentioned it earlier, Genesis is 4 events and 4 people. Those 4 events are creation, fall, flood, and tower. We've got some, I painted these myself over here tonight so you could see them. And then you've got, I'm just kidding. And then you've got the 4 people. You've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, or Abe, Ike, Jake, and Joe, as I've finally begun to refer to them because I felt like I spent enough time with them now that we're on a nickname basis at this point. And so creation. And so we jump right into Genesis. So Genesis 1 and 2 is about creation. And it's an amazing story. So again, if you're an Israelite, you're going, who is this God? Moses is like, hey, Genesis 1, he creates things from his mouth. From the breath of God, he is able to create everything in existence. The entire universe comes forth from his words. He is all powerful. He is all creator God. That's a God we're following, right? And then we get to Genesis 2, and he begins to narrow in. So humanity was created in Genesis 1, but he narrows in Genesis 2. And there's an intimacy there. There's an exchange there between man and God in Genesis 2. It's interesting. In Genesis 1, the word used to describe God is Elohim. It's the Hebrew word for powerful God. He is big and powerful. He speaks things into existence. And then Genesis 2 begins to narrow down. And the word used there to describe God is Yahweh. It's a relationship word. It's the covenant-making God. In fact, it was a word so sacred that good Jewish men and women wouldn't even use that word. Instead, they would say Adonai when they would see Yahweh in their text. It was sacred. It was special. It was relational. So right off the bat, if you're an Israelite, you say, what kind of God am I being asked to follow? Well, he's a God who's all-powerful and yet all-loving and relational. In Genesis 1:26, we learn that God says, let us make man in our image. Let us make man in our image. There's a communal, there's a plurality to God. He exists in Trinity form in eternity past. And so we are image bearers of God. We reflect a holy and perfect and righteous God, and this matters. It means humanity has dignity. It means that even though you've been a slave for 400 years as an Israelite, you matter because you bear God's image. And you today, Watermark women, 2013, Dallas, Texas, you bear God's image. And your friends and your family, even though they don't always act like it, they bear God's image too. So does the stranger on the street, and so does the person, the enemy in your life. We're image bearers of God. And so there is certain there are laws that define the way that we should act with humans because of our image bearingness of God. And so right off the bat, what kind of God are we being asked to follow? An all-powerful and yet loving God. And then we get to Genesis 3 through 5. We go from creation, we go to fall. And this story is well known. Here's the tree here. Eve, you can eat anything you want in the garden, but don't eat from this tree. And of course, Eve, as we know, eats the apple. And not to be confused, ladies, it says that Adam was with her, standing by her side. So God creates everything, and he gives humanity free choice and free will. And as we are apt to do, they ate the apple. And I have to tell you, I would have eaten the apple, and you would have eaten the apple. And I know that because every time God puts a metaphorical, even literal apple in my way and says, don't touch that, I am, without the Spirit, always running towards it. But because of the Holy Spirit and some abiding and sanctification God's done in my life, I don't always eat the apple, but I would have in the garden, and so would you. So what does that mean? It means that humanity, if left to our own devices, we will choose to sin. And that's the fall. God created humanity, but he created them with free will. And in our free will, we chose to eat the apple. And so we chose to invite sin and chaos and death into the world. After Adam and Eve, there's Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel continue to perpetuate the sin that is introduced by their parents. It doesn't get better after the fall. But what we learn in that time is that in Genesis 3, God comes in and he says that from the seed of this woman, there will be a son who will, that the serpent will strike at his heel, but his heel will crush the serpent's head. And that's actually an early prophecy of Jesus Christ, that God sending Jesus Christ was a plan B for the garden. God didn't come down and go, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with Adam and Eve now. He knew that if he was going to give them the choice to disobey, is the only way he could give them the choice to obey. And so in their disobedience, he still created a way for them to come back and to be restored to him. So that's the fall, is that even though that we rebelled against God, even though that we ran from him, and even though Cain is still a little bit of a jerk to God, God is kind to him and puts a seal of protection over him in Genesis 4 and 5. So what does that mean? It means that God is kind to sinners. What kind of God are the Israelites being asked to follow? A kind God. That even in the midst of total human rebellion, even the worst moment in human history, that God is kind to Adam and Eve, he's kind to Cain. And so creation, fall, and then flood. And we've got Noah's Ark, and this is a famous story. Russell Crowe is having a movie come out soon, and this is an endorsement for it. That's just a random fact in case you didn't know. And so the fall, and so what we learned from the flood is we learned that there's a high premium on God's holiness. We learned that even though that this happened, that sin and death entered into the world, God says, hey, listen, I want you to stop sinning. And Genesis 6 actually says that the sin had become so great, it began to grieve God that he had ever created humanity. What does that tell you about God if you're an Israelite? What does that tell you today if you're sitting in our house? It tells you that God absolutely cares about what we do. That his holiness is something that we should reflect because we're his image bearers. And when we come up short, that there are sometimes consequences for that. No, there are always consequences for it. Sometimes they're instant, other times there's delay. But sin brings death and chaos into the world. And so God sends a flood. But as God is apt to do, the God, the creator of the universe, saved Noah and his family. And not because Noah was a self-righteous dude, but because Noah believed in God and was walking in a manner worthy of God. And so God says, I'm going to use you as a testimony to the future generations. And he puts them in the boat, and Noah and his family survives the flood. And that's the flood. And what does God do? At the end of it, he puts a rainbow up. And he says, I will never again destroy the earth in the manner that I have. Why? Because God relents of his wrath. It doesn't come on us in tenfold ways that we can't withstand. It's always in the proportion that it should be, because God is a God of justice. So if you're an Israelite, what kind of God am I being asked to follow? You're asked to follow a just God, and his holiness should not be tampered with. And sometimes it's on very large magnitude, and other times God winks at our sin for a season so that his kindness will lead us to repentance. But he is God. Make no mistake about that. So we've got creation, we've got fall, we've got flood, and then we got tower. So after the flood, God allows the boat to land on the mountain, and Noah and his family come out, and he tells them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and then he says, spread out. And because of insecurity, because of fear, because of all these things, humanity does what we always do. We hunch together, we're like, man, God, I know you told us to spread out, but there's danger in spreading out, and so rather, we're going to come together, we're going to build a huge tower that's going to reach up to the heavens, and we're going to make a name for ourselves, because if we're famous, people won't mess with us. If we have a name for ourselves, then people will fear us in the land, and those big, huge Philistines will not come after us. And it's interesting because they didn't actually mean that they were going to build like a literal tower that reaches to heaven. Like I know, like in the kids' stories, we're like, oh, they climbed up. Like they were just building these huge structures, right? And so it was just a big man-made structure to say we're big and bad is what it was. But the Hebrew author, Moses, does something really fun with it because he said, we are going to make a tower that reaches up to heavens. But then Moses says, but God had to condescend to them. And when God comes down, he disciplines them in this way that he confuses their language and he spreads them across the face of the earth. That's where we get the Tower of Babel. Like when people speak confusingly, there's babbling of languages. That's where we get that term from. And so what does this tell us? Well, one, God always has to condescend. Anytime man thinks he can reach God, that he has fooled himself. And he's fooled anybody he can get to believe that lie. No. You don't need to rely on your strength. You don't need to rely on your towers. You don't need to rely on the man-made structures in order to be saved by God. Instead, God will be the one that protects you. And if God tells you to do something, his plan, his will, his good plan that's going to be brought into existence is going to happen whether you like it or not. If God tells you to multiply, fill the earth, and spread out, and you don't do it, well, God's still going to spread you out. Why? Because his plan supersedes humanity's wanderings. And that's not to say that God's will will always bring you kicking and screaming, that sometimes you can just exist outside of God's best for you. We're going to see that with the Israelites. They're actually going to come to a point where they don't trust in God. He's going to allow them to wander in the wilderness until an entire generation dies off. And so the Israelites are going to learn this, that it's not, oh, you can disobey God. He's going to always put you where he wants you. There are certain blessings you will miss out on because you're disobeying God. But God's ultimate plan, his ultimate will supersede our stupidity, our rebellion, and our man-made plans. And now that tower that was to reach the heavens to protect them is really just a monument to their stupidity and rebellion. So that's the first few events of Genesis. You've got creation, you've got fall, you've got flood, and you've got tower. And so up until this point, these events are telling us about this God. He's big, he's powerful, he's loving, he's kind to sinners, he's got a premium on his holiness, and that his plan will always supersede our pride and our willingness to put ourselves first. And then Genesis does this cool thing. From Genesis 11 and 12, we get a switch from events to people. And God says, okay, now I want you to know what I'm like as you see how I relate to man. So God goes to this man named Abram, who's living in Ur, the Chaldeans, you are, Ur. He goes in and says, hey, Abe, buddy, I want you to pick up your life and I want you to follow me to the land of Canaan. I'm going to give it to you. And in chapter 12 and in chapter 15, he tells Abraham this. He says, I'm going to give you land, I'm going to give you seed, I'm going to give you blessing. That's what we know as the Abrahamic covenant. And my good friend Blake Holmes, who's the equipping director here at Watermark, always says, you can tell how well somebody knows their Bible if they can explain what a passage has to do with the Abrahamic covenant. And so it's a fun challenge I like to do, and so I want to pass it on to you guys. In the Abrahamic covenant, you can begin to see God being faithful to it throughout not only Genesis, but the rest of the Old Testament. And so land was the literal land of Canaan that God was going to show him. Seed was going to be an actual child from the womb of Abraham and his wife Sarah. And then blessing was going to be that eventually from that line, we know that Christ comes, and we know that Abraham and his family are going to be a blessing to the generations to come. And so God comes to Abraham. What's so crazy about this is at this point, Abraham and Sarah are old, and Sarah's been barren her entire life. And in the ancient Near East, there is a high value on having offspring. And so up to this point, Sarah's been living in really what would be shame upon her because of this. But God promises her, hey, I'm going to bring you an offspring. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to bless your family. And so you think Abraham and Sarah are like, okay, we're going to huddle up and we're going to do what God tells us to do. And what's really crazy is they don't do that at all. They don't do that at all. But God is faithful to them, even in the midst of their rebellion. What's really cool in Genesis 15 is that there's this covenant thing that happens between Abraham and God. It's very subtle, but it says a deep sleep comes upon Abraham, and a great sleep comes over him. So Abraham's laying over here on the side, he's sleeping. And then it talks about a bright light passing between the carcasses laying on the ground. And in the ancient Near East, what was cool is when you made a covenant with somebody, you would kill the carcasses, you'd lay them on the ground, and the two parties would pass between as if to say, we're in covenant with each other. We've made an agreement, we're in relationship, this is how it's going to work. Well, here we see Abraham laying on the ground, and God is the only one passing through. And what it means is it's an unconditional, unilateral covenant. God is going to be faithful despite what Abraham does. Abraham never walked through there. This covenant isn't dependent on Abraham's obedience. It's completely dependent on God's faithfulness. And so what happens with Abraham is a righteous guy. I don't mean to throw him entirely under the bus, but his life is laid before us. So there are times of absolute failure on Abraham's part, where he goes into a new land and he lies to the Pharaoh and he says, that is my sister rather than my wife, because he's scared God won't protect them from the Pharaoh. And then you think he learns his lesson from that, and then he does it again and he lies to Abimelech about who his wife is. And there's all these opportunities for Abraham to falter in his faith. One very major example of it is in the ancient Near East, it was an acceptable custom that if a woman was barren, to give her maidservant to her husband, and then the offspring from the maidservant would be really credited to the account of the wife. And so Sarah and Abraham, in a moment of lack of faith, do that, and Hagar is given to Abraham. And I don't think you had to ask Abraham twice to sleep with her, so they go off and they do their thing, and then they come on back, and there's a son, Ishmael. And God has to come to him. He goes, no. Abraham, Sarah, look at me. You guys will have a son. I am an all-powerful creator God. I can do anything. I can bring the dead back to life. I can split the sea. I can flood the entire earth. I can make things right. So it is not that far-fetched to think I can put a child in your womb. So he tells them, hey, you're going to have an offspring. And so all these chapters, between chapters 15 and 21, as we see high moments for Abraham and low moments for Abraham, but what is steady through that entire time is God's dealing with him. He is going to be faithful. He's going to protect Abraham. He's going to protect Abraham's land. He's going to protect Abraham's family. Lot and his wife, when they're down in Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's going to be judgment that's going to pour down on Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet God spares Lot because of the blessing that Abraham has on him. And so then in chapter 21, despite all these ups and downs, we see God continuing to be faithful to that Abrahamic covenant. And Sarah is pregnant with a child, and they have Isaac. And his name means he laughs, because there's different types of laughter in that portion, but overall the last laugh is the laughter of joy of a child being brought into this world. And so God comes to a barren woman and a 100-plus-year-old man, and he just says, hey, I can do anything. If you're an Israelite leaving Egypt and God is promising you something, you're standing before foes that are bigger than you, they're better than you, they're stronger than you, and God says, no, I promise this to you. How encouraging would that be to look at Abraham and go, man, Abraham was promised a son. And despite all the biology in the world, despite everything and all of these obstacles in Sarah and Abraham's way, despite the infertility, despite the old age, despite the unhealthy living conditions of just being in the ancient Near East, God provided them with a son. And so chapter 21 of Genesis, Isaac is born. And then in chapter 23, God comes to Abraham and he says, that child of promise, I want you to sacrifice him for me. I want you to take him up to the Mount Moriah. I want you to lay him on the altar, and I want you to take his life. What a task of obedience. But what we learn about Abraham is through all his years of ups and downs, he's begun to learn a little bit of God's character. And from learning of God's character, he's learned that God's character is trustworthy. And so Abraham, despite, again, uncertainty and all of these things, he takes his boy, he walks him up the mountain. And like a lot of people imagine, Isaac is this small child, so Abraham's carrying him, but we know from Scripture that Isaac's actually a young man at this point. And so Isaac is carrying his own bundle of wood up the mountain. So you talk about a faith legacy, that not only is Abraham walking up the mountain, but his son, who no doubt could physically overpower him, is going, okay, if you say God's with us and this is what needs to happen, I'm going with you. That's crazy faith. So they walk up the mountain as God is apt to do in the nick of time, as he's getting ready to slay his son. The ram comes out of the thicket, and God goes, whoa. There's your sacrifice. And if you want to find Jesus in that story, see, a lot of times people are like, Jesus is Isaac. No. Yes, Jesus was a long-awaited son. Yes, he was prophesied about. But Jesus in that story is the ram. See, God didn't need to kill Isaac because Isaac's death would have been ineffectual for the sins of the world. But God, a couple thousand years later, does take his son's life. And with his death, brings the forgiveness of sins. With his death brings renewal. With his death brings regeneration. And so the ram is the sacrifice, and the ram is the representative of Christ in that story. And so that's really sort of the end of Abraham's journey after that. We get into chapter 24, and chapter 24 is about finding a bride for Isaac. And so it's this incredible story where Abraham sends his servant who's going to go find a woman for Isaac, because if you remember, land, seed, blessing, the seed has to continue. The seed has to continue. So Isaac needs a wife, and so Abraham in his last, few acts on earth is this incredible obedience on top of Mount Moriah, and it's this incredible obedience to go, I need to find a wife for my son, for my family. And so the servant goes all these miles back to Abraham's family, finds a wife, and that's how Genesis 24 is. And it's just an incredible story. It's an incredible story of God being faithful, even in the midst of humanity just absolutely bombing it. I mean, can you imagine being Eve in the garden, eating that apple and then hiding in shame, and God comes in the garden and says, hey, where are you? Where are you? I know what you've done. Let me provide skins for you. Let me provide clothing and provision for you. And yes, there are consequences for your sin. You will have pain in childbirth. You will want to rule over your husband. Like, absolutely, there is a price to pay when you choose to sin. But not an ultimate price, because I will pay that for you. See, the story of Genesis is meant to encourage the Israelites. And can you imagine? They go, what kind of God are you asking us to serve? A big, powerful, loving, relational, kind, faithful God. What an invitation Moses is giving to these people. And what's crazy is we're giving you the same invitation, and it stands today. That's why we are so excited for this Bible study to start back up. And yes, there's a buzz of excitement of seeing old friends, and there's a buzz of excitement of getting back into your groups that we put you in your small groups. And for those of you that are new, we cannot wait to see your faces. We've prayed for you, and we're excited for you. But more than all of that, I'm so excited for you to meet the God of Genesis. And for some of you, this may be the first time you've ever met him, and so brace yourselves. He will love your soul to the fullest extent that you will know love in ways you could not understand before. For those of you that are old friends with God, and maybe you've lost touch with him, allow him, like he says in Hosea, to take you into the wilderness and speak tenderly to you and allure you back so you can remind yourself of who your first love is. And for those of you who know him well and you've been running with him, be encouraged. Be encouraged by these stories of old. So Genesis 25 through 50, we're going to continue to see God's faithfulness. We're going to continue to see trials and hardships. This life is hard. Those Israelites coming out of Egypt, it was so difficult for them that they at times would say, we would rather be back in Egypt. And for me, I'm like, wait, back in Egypt. They were your slave owners. They oppressed you. They beat you. They murdered you. They in every way you can be broken and beaten. That's what was happening. And so I'm guessing that the journey that God had them on was one of hardships and trials, that somebody would even dare to say, I'd rather be back in Egypt. And I'm not naive. Some of you are going, yeah, I get that. God's brought me on a journey that I'd rather not be on. And it's paved with hardship, and it's paved with uncertainty, and it's paved with potholes that seem a little too big for me to go over. And recently I went on a retreat with the ladies of Watermark Fort Worth, and they talked about how so many times you hear God won't give you more than you can handle. And I think, wow, what a bunch of heresy. No, he absolutely will give you more than you can handle. Because those are the places where God meets you and says, I will handle this. I'll put the ram in the thicket to provide for you. So I'm so excited to get to start Genesis again. And we're going to launch into it. The themes of Genesis 1 through 24 of God's faithfulness despite failure is going to continue on through the end of Genesis. And so we're excited to see you on Wednesday. We're going to jump right in Genesis 25 through 26. And so if you haven't gotten a PDF in your email yet of it, if you're new, let us know. We'll send you one. And for those of you who have your curriculum, we're going to jump in that day. And so, come on, let's do this.